Sorry about that. Welcome, everybody. We have everyone, which is exciting. We are going to get started. Welcome to our RDA meeting for today, December 10th, 2019. It is the last RDA meeting of the year. Who knows, we might start singing. I ran up the stairs. So, okay, we'll start with general comments to the board. If anyone has anything they would like to say to the board about anything at all, you'll have 2 minutes to speak. If you want to fill out a green card and hand it to one of our staff members or just come up, Elizabeth is over here, so you can hand it to her. The only card I have right now is Brent Koga. So if you want to come up. It does smell Christmassy.
My Christmas lotion.
Brent, did you want to speak? Oh, I'm sorry. Apologies. It's on the back. Got it. In that case, we have no other cards, nobody who wants to say anything to the council. So we are going to move on to RDA business. I apologize for this. I am switching around the agenda a little bit. We have a council member or board member who needs to leave, so I wanted all of us to be here for this agenda item, and that is agenda item number 5, which is a resolution for Block 67 North Tax Increment Reimbursement Agreement. We'll have Allison, Danny, and Corinne here at the table. I've also noticed that we have a couple of people. Brent is from our Japanese American community, and the developer, Ryan Ritchie, is also here for board members' awareness.
Blake from the county is also here as well.
What was that?
Blake from the county is also here.
Oh, great. I didn't see Blake. Where is he? He's in the back. Oh, got it. Hi. Hi, Blake.
He's trying to hide. Sorry, I was waiting to see if Allison was joining us, so we will jump on in. See, I knew you were coming. Okay, the item before you today is the Block 67 Tax Increment Reimbursement Agreement. Did you want to say anything to start, or you want us to jump in? I'm sorry, I just started running with it.
I'm sorry, because I just got here. I think I think the board members are well aware of this project that we've been working on for about 18 months. As you know, just as a recap, and Salt Lake City involvement in Block 67 and Block 67 North in particular was requested by Salt Lake County. This is something that Salt Lake City did not seek, but they are cooperating with the county and with the project. You are cooperating because of this request from the county. The board has worked hard to negotiate public benefits for this project, which wouldn't have been realized without the board's involvement. And I'm sure Danny and Corinne will get into those in more detail. But you've also identified a number of additional benefits for Japantown, the adjoining community, which were not contemplated in the original agreements. And so this is the final stage of the board's involvement for now with the Block 67 North project, which has been structured as a pay-for-performance project so that the board is able to make sure that the agreements they've negotiated are fulfilled by the developers. So that's sort of a general overview, and take it back away, Denny.
Okay. Thank you, Allison. We'll go through our PowerPoint rather quickly because I know we're somewhat limited on time. So just wanted to build off what Allison said in terms of the impetus from this project originally came in the 2018 legislative session, where the legislature allocated $15 million for regionally significant programs, and they targeted the county to be the ones to disperse these funds. That project came to us between the county and the developer of the Ritchie Group within which we would then provide the conduit and the transfer of funds from the county, the $15 million to the developer, and then also provide a reimbursement agreement to fund back to the county repayment of that $15 million. In exchange, the development would include a significant amount of parking that was to be built for the convention center as well as the Vivint Smart Home Arena and surrounding uses. And so ultimately the way the structure would flow is that the county would then, upon receiving those funds back with tax increment, would then set up a program to revolve those funds for ongoing parking projects. And so this is the last piece that you as a board are adopting. You've already created the project area, adopted the plan, as well as authorized the interlocal agreements between the county and the city and the RDA for the collection of that increment.
This is the Block 67 North area map, and the CRA boundaries outlined in yellow on the north side of the block. And to orient you, that's 100 South on the north and 200 South, 2nd West, and 3rd West. The Ritchie Group's proposed West Quarter project, which is taking place on Block 67, is mixed-use project with roughly $198 million in private investment in Phase 1 alone. Is that not on? Sorry. Okay. And the project aligns with several of the downtown master plan's goals, in particular increased density downtown, mid-block walkways funded by agency projects, creation of sports and entertainment area, and parking for Vivint and surrounding uses. And the West Quarter project has 2 phases as depicted here with this map. And Phase 1 takes place within the CRA on the north side of the block. Phase 2 is on the south side and not within the CRA. And the chart breaks down the details by phase that are included within our tax increment reimbursement agreement. And as you can see, the overall project has residential, retail, hotel, office, public parking, and a mid-block walkway. And Phase 1 is scheduled to begin by the end of this year and be completed by April 2020, with Phase 2 starting immediately after Phase 1 and taking about 3 to 4 years.
And then won't get into a lot of detail on this other than we just wanted to show this is the budget for the overall project area. So today we're speaking specifically to the $15 million that is to be reimbursed through the developer back to the county for the parking structure. But the overall project area budget is $20 million, and that is to include the elements of administration and operations, as well as 10% to affordable housing and the infrastructure improvements, both respectively. So the overall project area budget is larger. This is for the $15 million, and the disbursements will be made in a pro rata basis as we receive the tax increment.
And there were several fundamental conditions required by the board for participation, which we have incorporated into the TIRA, and they're further referenced within the memo in your term sheet in the packet. This includes the mid-block walkway, the public parking stalls, the Phase 2 guarantee, and considerations for Japantown. We broke the Japantown considerations into 3 categories, and they were agreed upon throughout the facilitation process. The design improvements, these are essentially addressing the Japanese American community's concerns that the original design of the project was back of house on 100 South. The good faith conditions are essentially, being a good neighbor, scheduling around trash pickup around church services, et cetera, and the adjacent property improvements, which is the opportunity for the churches and the developer to work together to regrade the properties that are closest to West Quarter project. And then additionally, for Japantown, we have, as Danny just mentioned, the 10% set aside of tax increment for projects implemented on 100 South, and the board also allocated the $100,000 for the design consultant, and we've comprised a committee and selected a consultant, and I expect to begin that process with them in January of 2020. And we'll also continue our monthly Japantown working group meetings in conjunction with the design strategy process. And we also anticipate the 10% tax increment set aside aligning as a funding stream with this design process. And finally, the RFP was written to incorporate maintenance and installation costs. So we're basing all of our work in essentially reality. And also, we have checkpoints throughout that process to check back in with the board and let you know where we are in the design process.
So the specific terms of the reimbursement agreement itself, it is a 20-year term which coincides with the life of the project area. The maximum cap reimbursement to the county is the $15 million. We have made it clear that the increment used to make that reimbursement is only generated off the 2 parcels that the developer owns, not the other properties within the project area. The agency is not responsible for any shortfall in increment. Whatever the project generates is what we reimburse, and that is as far as our obligation goes. We also have not made any commitments or obligations for Phase 2. You'll recall that's part of our CBD project area. That would be a different process to request any funding, and then that would come back to the board as well. And then additionally, the requirement or the reimbursement agreement has requirements in it that are tied to the public benefits that are guaranteed both within the parking structure itself, the mid-block connection, as well as the benefits that the developers incorporating as part of their project for the benefit of the Japanese American community, as well as clawback provisions within that reimbursement and how much the developer gets. Those are tied to the guarantee for building Phase 2. And then finally, on an annual basis, the developer is required to verify and report on the number of parking stalls and that they are still in fact being allocated and set aside for public use, sorry.
And finally, we presented the TIRA to the RDA Finance Committee, and they had similar concerns to this board in RAC, which was how to guarantee Phase 2 and if the parking stalls is a public benefit, we really commensurate with the $15 million pass-through. And they felt that the clawback provisions that we did include in the TIRA and the additional public benefit, including the Japantown considerations, and also developing a traditionally utilized block in the affordable housing set-aside made the project worth it, and they recommended approval of the TIRA 6-0. And in closing, also, as Amy mentioned, we have representatives from the Ritchie Group as well as the county. And unfortunately, Janie Iwamoto is going to be here. She couldn't be here till 2, so I don't think she'll be available for comment. But we can answer any questions that you have, or if you wish to speak to those representatives as well.
Thank you for that. Board members, are there any questions? James,
Yes.
did you? Chris?
So, my concern from the beginning, or one of my main concerns from the beginning, has been making sure that Japantown is protected and that we protect that asset of the Japanese American community in our city. So what, I guess if you can explain sort of in very, in layman's terms, how are we protecting them and their interest in this project and the public benefits that would go towards bettering that place?
Great. We basically broke down the items that were identified throughout the facilitation process into 3 different groups, and those were so they could be applied legally as most effectively as possible. The design improvements, as I had mentioned, were essentially the Japanese American community's concerns were that the building was designed back of House to 100 South. So through the facilitation process, the Ritchie Group in the community identified ways that they could really improve the design, essentially. And there's 6 of those within your packet that are included. And the way they're going to be implemented is with a good faith conditions, with a covenant to cooperate. So essentially, we didn't want that to be a legal agreement between the community and the Ritchie Group. We wanted it to be within our agreement so that Japanese American community didn't have to sign it, but it was recorded on the land in Ritchie Group's property so that it runs with the land, and it's really their responsibility to execute. The second part are the good faith conditions, so these are the good neighbor conditions. They'll schedule trash pickup, temporarily relocate deliveries during festivals. These are a little bit harder to enforce legally, but they're included, and these also are recorded as part of that covenant. So that's how those 2 are taken care of. And then the third piece are the adjacent property improvements. So originally in the facilitation process, the Ritchie Group identified that if there could potentially be a 12-foot wall, which we didn't want to happen, so that the Japanese American community could connect to the development, and if they wanted to develop their own property in the future, they could do so. So we've made it a requirement that the Ritchie Group doesn't build the wall, and essentially also offers the opportunity to regrade those lots for future connection or essentially. So that one is an option, but we gave them more time to come to terms with that so that they have till 2026 to do those improvements, and if not, we have a clawback provision where we can retain $250,000 in tax increment to invest into the 100 South streetscape.
Okay.
And then just in general, as was a concern for RAC, and so you may have answered this right when I stepped out, but what other ways are we making sure that we're protecting the public benefit in this project? Because I know that it is going to be a significant increase in taxes for the city, but when we're giving away RDA money, we want to make sure that we're protecting that investment. So what are our legal protections?
So with the mid-block walkway, that is, let's jump to the map real quick. The mid-block walkway essentially is going to take place in phase 1 and phase 2. Sorry, this map is better. You can see it a lot better in this one. So essentially, we have included that within the tier that if it isn't built or isn't represented in plans and permits and they stop construction, we have the right to cease payment on the tax increment back to the county. So both in phase 1 and phase 2, we have the opportunity. With public parking stalls, it's very similar. Essentially, if those aren't incorporated, and we also defined what public parking means. We have the ability to stop payment on the tax increment. And then phase 2, we implemented a cap on phase 1. So we said $3 million is commensurate with the public benefit we're getting for that phase. We'll only pay up to $3 million, or you have till 2026 essentially. And if you prove by certain requirements that phase 2 is going to start, we will then continue to pay up to the 15. And then within phase 2, we also have the ability to stop payment if the project stops or isn't going to be completed.
Thank you. I know, Andrew, did you have a question, or did that?
The first question's a parking question. So there's 46 in phase 1, public stalls, and then 1,200 or so in phase 2, we're thinking?
Correct.
Is there a term on those that they would be made public, or is it indefinite?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that? Is there
So of the parking stalls that are right now supposed to be public based on the $15 million public money, is there a term on those, or are they indefinitely public?
I believe it's within the lifetime of the CRA.
So 20 years?
Yeah.
After that, is it up to the owner essentially?
Correct.
Do we have any precedents for that anywhere else in our areas of the city that we're aware of?
Not that I believe tied to public parking or maintaining public parking. And so that's essentially just what the extent of our clawback provision and requirements would be. To go beyond that, I think that would be a deal point that the county probably would have needed to negotiate early on if that was to be an ongoing, like a deed restriction placed on the property.
So at this point, there's nothing we could do about that particular contract?
Probably not. Our limitations are tied to the reimbursement of the increment.
For our affordable housing units, do we tie that to the length of an area, or is it separate?
For affordable housing, we either defer to what the term is if they have tax credits and if that's a 99-year, or for the agency, we typically prefer a minimum of 50.
Mm-hmm.
We have done some that are down to 30 if it's more of a market rate type housing project that we're infusing affordability in, but 50 is where we would prefer to come in at.
Okay. I do have a concern about that, Madam Chair. A 20-year contract seems problematic to me personally. If we're going to rely on this for a public parking going forward by eliminating surface lots and other parts like that and rely on this, 20 years may not be sufficient in my view, but I'm not sure what we can do about it at this point. So the second question just came up actually in a comment about tying the surface improvements, the regrading that thing to looks like construction easements, crane access easement, those things. Help me understand that piece.
So within the memo on page 9, we make a note that under adjacent property improvements that the Ritchie Group has tied their proposals to complete the adjacent property improvements to request that the churches allow what they're calling a soil and nails agreement, which is for shoring and crane air access. The reason we included that was because it was our understanding, as well as the churches, that the adjacent property improvements were on the table as a standalone item, not in exchange for the agreement, but and the Ritchie Group's available if they'd like to speak to as well. But it's a pretty common agreement between neighboring parties. with construction. And I believe the Ritchie Group has said they've received that from other neighbors. So we put that in there because that was a last-minute addition from the Ritchie Group, and we felt it was of importance to acknowledge. And the reason we allow the Japanese American Church the time up to 2026 to come to terms with the Ritchie Group is because it does require a legal agreement between the two, and we wanted to maintain that balance of power where the Ritchie Group has full legal counsel, the churches have pro bono counsel. The Ritchie Group's timeline is a lot faster than the churches, so we wanted to make sure that they had more time to make sure that if they do in fact go into an agreement with the Ritchie Group, it's on their timeline and they can make sure it's completely 100% something that they're comfortable with.
So what would be the timeline on, say, regrading of the street and those kind of improvements to that to First South?
The timeline for improvements to 100 South are essentially what will come out of the consultant study as we create that menu of improvements that can be done, what the costs are, what the maintenance costs are, and kind of what the priority would be moving forward. And so we haven't set that timeline. That's not contingent upon any part of this development, as much as we're running that as a separate process where we can continue to work with that stakeholder group and identify both what they want to do, how we can pay for it, and then when those would take place.
And also the design strategy is for the public right-of-way, where these are two private parcels owned by the Japanese American community, so they're separate, and we anticipate the design strategy taking 6 to 9 months. It's a pretty big process, public engagement, and 3 final designs, and then we would line it up with the potential for CIP funding or our tax increment, the 10% set aside, and the working group will continue working throughout that, and our idea is to empower them to start selecting which improvements they want to see first and identify and go after funding accordingly.
Would the city perform that work and then get reimbursed through the Ritchie Group?
No, that's not anything that the developer would necessarily have a part in or be required. As we said, we separated that from the requirements of the development in the project itself and treated that as something that we would just provide the options and the design and the information so that they could then, as a stakeholder group, start seeking opportunities for funding and figure out what their priorities are.
I just meant for actual work on, if they decide to do, say, regrading of the street or something like that, the city would perform that and get reimbursed through the $100,000 or whatever other monies?
Wait.
Or is that just for design?
We do have 10% of the TI budget set aside for improvements to 100 South, and so depending on who does that work, what the original funding is, yeah, that would be available.
Okay.
I'm sorry, did you mean the repave of the adjacent properties or 100 South itself?
100 South itself is my question. So if there's a disagreement between the Ritchie Group and the stakeholders here, and what protects the stakeholders, I guess, essentially here?
So the 100 South streetscape improvement is separate. So the adjacent property improvements, essentially, if they don't come to terms, we retain the $250,000, which we would put into 100 South streetscape, because that's what we essentially have control over, be the public right of way.
Okay. I mean, my concern was just tying it to the ability to do the construction easement to getting that funding for the improvements seemed problematic.
Right, we set it up to where the developer and the Japanese American property owners could negotiate a separate agreement, and then within that agreement they would outline what the requirements are and the protections for both parties. If that doesn't happen, or they choose not to, then we have set it up to where we have that $250,000 that we can then make available specifically for either that property or improvements to 100 South. So we've kind of set it up both ways to where they either agree or we've got a plan B to where we can step in and provide that assistance as well.
And the reason we wanted that clawback was because each church has their own board. The representatives that we work with, they represent their board. They have their own process. And we wanted to make sure that they had the ability to say yes or no separate from what we're doing with the 100 South streetscapes.
Okay.
And overall, we're looking at it as benefits for Japantown. So if that 250 doesn't go directly into their property, it is going into the betterment and the revitalization of Japantown overall. And so that's why we have the clawback. We give them ample time to come to terms with the Ritchie Group. If one of the churches or both of the churches decide not to, we have the ability to retain the increment and put it into the Japantown streetscape.
And we won't be involved in those discussions going forward, or will we?
We do have in the TIRA the right for the agency to review the documents. Yeah.
Charlie.
Madam Chair, thank you. So this is a project that normally I think us as an RDA board, or we as an RDA board, would be, really, really excited about, without any sort of hesitations, because it really is a good project. It really is going to do a lot for the city, and especially that part of the city in terms of redevelopment. So I do look forward to the development as it progresses, and do believe that it is going to be a net benefit for the city. It's frustrating the way that this came to us. This is in the 8 years that I've been on the RDA board. We've never had a project that has been like this, that has been where we've essentially been told by the state and the county, this is what you have to do. This is how it's going to have to work. That being said, I think that I want to thank RDA staff for working with the developer. I want to thank Ryan Ritchie and your partners for working with the RDA staff. I especially want to thank the Japanese community for continuing to push, working with the developers, working with the RDA. This board, during the entire time that we've been discussing this and negotiating this, have never forgotten Japantown. We have looked to make this project as beneficial to the Japanese American community as we possibly can, and it is something that I'm very, very happy to finally close the door on and move forward with, so that we can start actually seeing the benefit of this project moving forward. So, Madam Chair, with that, I move that the board approve the resolution authorizing execution of Block 67 North Tax Increment Reimbursement Agreement.
I have a motion by Board Member Luke, a second by Board Member Rogers. Is there any discussion? I am going to say something before I call for a vote. I agree with everything Charlie said. I think the Japanese American community in Japantown and the Ritchie Group for coming together and working hard on negotiating this. But most importantly, I want to give a huge shout out and a huge thanks to the RDA staff, particularly Corinne and Katie Lewis, our attorney. I know you guys have put in a lot of hard work and passion and compassion into this project and working with our communities and really trying to create something that will be a benefit to Salt Lake. And I admire the two of you for all of the hard work that you've done, especially over these last few months. So thank you for that. And with that, I'll call for a vote. All those in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, that motion passes. Thank you. All right. Next, we have the RDA. We're going to go back. So the RDA audit review. Oh, no, I need approval of minutes. So it's for Tuesday, November 12th of 2019.
Motion to approve those minutes.
Second. I have a motion by Board Member Wharton and a second by Board Member Mendenhall. All those in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Great. That passes. And now for the RDA audit review and approval for fiscal year 2018-2019. And I have Mary Beth and Mike Mickelson, please. Hi, sorry.
You're fine.
I didn't see you there. I just am used to Danny just starting to talk, so
Oh.
I'm just kidding. Please, Mary Beth.
I'm
take it
quieter
away.
than Danny, much quieter than Danny.
Welcome.
Thank you. So we are here to discuss the RDA financial audit. It was completed by, I think, about the end of November, and Mike Mickelson from Eide Bailey, who is the lead partner for the RDA, will discuss the audit.
Great, thank you. Welcome.
Thank you. I appreciate being here. Sorry, I just saw on the agenda I was at 1 o'clock. My calendar said 2, so I apologize for being late.
Not a problem, and actually, I switched the agenda on everyone anyway, so it worked out perfectly.
Okay, wonderful. As Mary Beth said, my name is Mike Mickelson. I'm an audit partner with Eide Bailey, and I was the engagement partner for the RDA audit. We issued our report November 19th and delivered it shortly after. Hopefully you have copies in your board packets, and you've been able to look at that if you wanted to. We also issued another letter that's required by audit standards when there's an entity like the City Council or the RDA Board that's charged with governance. And so I'll go over our auditor's report briefly and then maybe a couple of highlights in that board communication letter. When we do an audit, there are some limitations. Our audit standards require that we do enough work and enough procedures to provide reasonable assurance. So we don't provide absolute assurance. There are some things that go into that. When we begin our audit, we begin by assessing risk on the different audit areas, financial statement line items, transaction cycles, those types of things. In addition to assessing risk, we gain an understanding and document our understanding in our work papers of the internal controls of the organization. That also helps with our risk assessment. And then we establish a materiality threshold. So we do that in planning. That's laid out in the auditor's responsibilities section of our auditor's report. But an audit area that has a higher risk and a higher materiality is an area we're going to spend more time and effort in and do more audit procedures in than an audit area that has a lower materiality and a lower risk. And so that's how we kind of divide up the time we spend in an audit in the different audit areas. We perform those procedures and gather our audit evidence and determine what kind of auditor's opinion we can issue. And so that's why there's some limitations, because we're doing things on a test basis and a sample basis. Those higher material and riskier areas are going to have larger samples. If we sample in a less risky or a less material area, they're going to have a much smaller sample. And so that's part of the reason there's some inherent limitations and why we were providing reasonable assurance instead of absolute assurance. After we performed our audit procedures for the RDA, we issued an unmodified opinion. So that is the clean opinion. That's the word people like to hear, a clean opinion that states that, in our opinion, the financial statements are fairly stated in all material respects in relation to generally accepted accounting principles. So that's all on page 1 of our auditor's report. There are some other matters on the second page. Just so you're aware, they deal with the required supplementary information and then just some supplementary information. There's 2 levels there. Required supplementary information is required by the Governmental Accounting Standards Board to be included with your financial statements. And that includes the management's discussion analysis that follows our audit opinion and precedes the financial statements. And there are a couple of pension schedules immediately following the footnotes that are also required supplementary information. We do not provide any assurance on that. We do some limited procedures in reading it and making sure it's consistent with our understanding of everything that we documented during our audit procedures. And then those are included, but they're not opined on. There's some supplementary schedules in the very back for additional analysis provided by the city. Combining balance sheet and combining statement of revenues and expenses by program. That is supplementary information. It's not required by anybody. It's added for additional information. It was probably added once at the request of the council or at the desire of the RDA management to be able to demonstrate certain things to the council or to the board. That we offer an in-relation opinion, which means that we've performed some limited procedures on that to tie it out to the financial statements that we've audited, to tie it out to any other audit documentation we obtained during our audit, so that we can say that those statements or those supplementary schedules are fairly stated in relation to the financial statements. So that is our auditor's report on the financial statements. If I were to get, I'll move quickly into the letter, because the letter would have a mention of any findings if there were any findings. And so that would be the next step, is to report to you that we didn't have findings that we need to communicate to you, either internal control or compliance. There have been findings in the RDA statements. It's been a couple of years since we've had some, but there was a period of turnover in accounting staff and some other issues that caused some findings, and just want to let you know that those were remediated in prior years and have not reared their head again this year. So in terms of internal controls and our gaining and understanding of that, we didn't have any concerns there or anything to report. And because we had no audit adjustments as well as the result of our procedures, then the monthly or periodic statements that you've reviewed as part of your oversight should be very similar to what's in the auditor's report. There might be some differences in presentation related to generally accepted accounting principles from what you've reviewed, but they should reconcile back without any audit adjustments. So your oversight responsibilities have, there aren't any adjustments to that. The final thing, and I'm only going to mention one point out of the additional letter, we're required to communicate any significant accounting estimates. Financial statements contain a number of estimates. Cash is about the only thing. If you pulled it out of the bank and lined up your bills and your coins, you could get an exact number on. Everything else is some level of an estimate. You have receivables. How much of those are you going to collect, for example? The one that we think is most significant, and that's because of its subjectivity in estimation, is the net pension liability. So Utah Retirement Systems calculates the net pension liability for all of the governments that participate in that system, and they hire actuaries to help them with that. So there are a number of actuarial assumptions that go into developing that pension liability. Then Utah Retirement Systems allocates that, and so they use some estimates that are less subjective in the allocation, but still estimates, and the city receives their allocation. And then once the city receives that, the city makes an allocation among the departments and component units. And again, I think that's a little bit less subjective than the actuarial determination, but that's what goes into putting that number in the financial statements, and that's why we want to communicate to you that we think it's a significant estimate. So that is everything I've prepared to say, but I'm happy to answer any questions if you have any.
Board members, any questions? Well, Mike, I'm glad we have somebody doing that and telling us that we are on the right track. It all sounds like good news to me, and I appreciate you guys doing this. So with that, I need a motion, please, to approve the audit. So moved, Madam Chair. Thank you. Who did that? Andrew? I have a motion by Board Member Luke and a second by Board Member Johnston. All those in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Great. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yep.
Next, we have our informational briefing on the Fair Park Public Market Feasibility Study. I have Ben Ludke, hopefully. Is Ben? Thanks. Danny. Cara. I have Fran, Kathy, and David. Fran and Kathy from CRSA Consultant, and David O'Neill, the Project for Public Spaces. The whole team, thank you for doing this study, by the way. Yeah. Does that work?
Yes.
Okay. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Hi, welcome. We're just, our council staff, Ben, is also going to join us. Do you want to? We left him out. Sorry, Ben. Just kidding. So, Ben, do you want to give us an overview if you're ready, or do you want me to make Danny do it?
I will just give a quick bit of context. The RDA board back in 2016 funded a study of the Depot District public market feasibility study. In July of 2017, there was a draft that came before the board for a presentation. There was a significant error in the calculations, which was later corrected. And in March the following year, 2018, the final report was presented to the board. The study before you today is also for a public market, but at the State Fair Park. This was funded in 2017 as part of the annual budget, and this is the final report on that topic. Outside of the funding for those two studies, which were both $175,000, there is no other money currently budgeted for a public market on the city side or the RDA side. So I think that gives you the groundwork of how we got here. I'll leave it to the RDA staff to fill in any other blanks.
So as Ben mentioned earlier this year, the RDA engaged a consultant. That team is made up of CRSA, Project for Public Spaces, and Zion's Public Finance. And we have David O'Neill from Project for Public Spaces here, and Fran Prine and Kathy Whedon from CRSA. The purpose of the study, the objectives that were identified in the RFP that was released, were to evaluate whether there was sufficient demand and supply to support a year-round public market at the Fair Park, to assess the Fair Park as a site to see if that's a viable site for a public market, and to evaluate development scenarios, whether the best scenario would be for a standalone market or a mixed-use development for the public market. So following public outreach, a technical analysis of the site, and an economic analysis of the surrounding area, the consultant recommended an incremental approach to phasing in a public market at the Fair Park that could take up to 10 years. And I think with that, I will turn it over to them to talk about their findings from the study.
Wonderful. Thank you all for being here and welcome.
Hi, I'm Fran Prine. As Kara told you, we were hired about a year ago, a little less, to determine if there is sufficient demand and supply to support a permanent year-round market at the Fair Park without subsidy. To cut to the kill, the people are there, the products are there, and the place is accessible but challenged. We had several TAC meetings, Technical Advisory Committee meetings, and we had placemaking workshops at said meetings. The key concepts that we derived from the meetings are this is a huge opportunity to build on current programming of the Fair Park. There is significant interest in the historic barns as a public market, both indoors and outdoors. Accessibility needs to be improved. The wall there surrounding that south side of the market on North Temple is a barrier and creates a fortress-like experience to some looking at the Fair Park. The market should be activated as a public space in order to be successful. And the best approach to this would be to start lighter, quicker, cheaper, with low-cost activation, with some simple placemaking techniques with which the Fair Park market can grow organically. David's now going to talk about our concept and our strategy to approaching a public market were it to move ahead.
As you may know, there are many types of public markets. You have almost a couple dozen markets operating in Salt Lake City today. So there's no one, when we say public market, we'll explain to you what the concept is that we have come up for the Fair Park initially, and what it could become down the road. So the mix of the market, the vendors, the things that would be sold there would be, this is a list, I don't need to read it, but it's you know, a beer garden, it would have public spaces, it would have local vendors, it would really feature predominantly, but not exclusively, vendors from the West Side who we met with, and there's a lot of talent there. As you may also know, that the downtown market is super popular, but it's full. So there's a growing vendor pool in Salt Lake that's looking for some new opportunities, and we see that there's some very interesting, like, cultural and culinary maker communities in Salt Lake that have expressed a desire for a venue, and they like the Fair Park. Markets are very visual. So we've just thrown some pictures up there, and these are, you know, the one on the lower right is in Melbourne, but some of the others are just sort of show the lighter, quicker, cheaper approach. They don't have to be really built out. You can just use a nice public space, activate the market. When the market's not there, you still have a nice public space that can be used for other things. We really like the international market that you have here, but it's, you know, it's what, a week or just a few days or something. And there's a lot of potential themes and vendors and products in there that could play into something at the Fair Park. A night market is another form of public market that we're seeing get some real traction in the country. You know, demographically, people are working and people have some time at night, and night markets are family friendly. They're not something that goes to midnight. They're usually, you know, start like at 4 or 5, have some dinner, and they're over by 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock. I will now turn it over to Kathy to go through some of the locational issues.
So Kara mentioned the fact that one of the first things we looked at was the potential for a developer-driven project or the possibility of reusing some existing space at the Fair Park for a lighter, quicker, cheaper approach. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about those two approaches for a second and talk to you about how we came to an initial conclusion. So originally our question to ourselves was there are two potential sites. South of North Temple, within property owned by the state, is the White Ball Field site. This is a potential development property that could potentially be used for a kind of ground-up activated space. It would have to be built in a single phase and probably in partnership with a development project. That project seemed to be something that the Fair Park and the state were interested in, but something that would come kind of in time and would probably be very comparable to the costs that we're seeing with other kind of from scratch markets, i.e. you'd have to do it all in one fell swoop and there'd be a pretty significant investment. The other option was to be able to use existing space within the Fair Park property. These include a series of barns along North Temple that Fran was pointing at. Barns 8, 9, and 10 run from the east to the west and end up just adjacent to the Jordan River site. We looked at a site that could be fenced off during the initial kind of growing of a farmer's market or a public market or a international market that could provide some kind of security and enclosure when other markets or other events were running at the Fair Park site, but that could also turn over when the Fair Park needed to run other events, and that initially. And this seemed to be a very nice way of being able to test, at least in the beginning, the potential of a market and its viability on the site without significant investment. So that was really the way we went from the initial activation on. We looked at 3 potential phases for the project. The first one was really just getting folks in facilities, and that was in the 2 barns to the east, barns 8 and 9, with this lighter, quicker, cheaper approach. Really using the space as it stands today with minor modifications to both facilities and sites, allowing for some great entry features, but utilizing parking that already exists, whether on the site or adjacent to the site, and capitalizing on the public transportation that delivers folks right to the front door at the south. But as we said, with very little need for significant investment, although there are some things that need to happen. And that would be the opportunity then to roll into 2 additional phases. Potentially the first phase would be years 1 through 3, phasing up on phase 2 would be years 4 through 9, and then after year 10, we'd call phase 3. And we'll walk through each of those with a little bit of detail so you can see what they look like. So the first phase of the project, and I apologize that this is not easy to show, we'll show you. So the first phase of the project really is in barns 8 and 9, and it takes out the wall between the two barns. It allows us to develop some minor site improvements so that we are running an event space both interior to the barns and exterior to the barns with the ability to set up kind of public market space. And as we said, with minimal investment inside the barns. And then when we move to phase 2, it gives us an opportunity to then grow into barn 10 with additional site development moving to the west.
You can pinch and zoom if you want.
Okay. Phase 3, that 10-year plus, gave us an opportunity to then think about the opportunity for whether it was the market itself or whether it was the fair park to grow additional event space within the two barns just north of barns 8, 9, 10 called the sheep barn and the market barn. And this gave us another opportunity to really engage activities along the riverfront property. We're just going to quickly go through what this might look like. In barns 8 and 9, what we're looking at is in the beginning, initial vendor stalls, which are set up as kind of 10 by 10 footprints. They have very limited physical improvements, just hand washing sinks, some outlets for power, and we give space for both event space and seating within those two barns. This gives us an opportunity to be able to kind of lay out the space in a whole variety of different ways. It gives a market vendor the opportunity to test what's being successful week to week, and it gives the vendor an opportunity to be able to see different things happening. As the project grows in success, we can shift things around and be able to grow from there. It also gives us an opportunity as the project becomes more successful to grow into barn 9 with potentially a larger opportunity to kind of nail down a full-time vendor or somebody who could take a larger kind of footprint for their space. As the project grows in its success, there can be some investment to outdoor activities. As we said, the first and most important component piece of the first phase is just making sure people understand that there's a market on the site, making sure people can get into the site, that there's ADA accessibility, and that there are spaces outside that are accessible and easy to set up, whether it's permanent or mostly impermanent market stalls. In phase 2 of the site, we get to some more permanent space developed between barns 8 and 9, and we grow to the west. This gives us additional space seasonally to have things outdoors as well as event space. And in phase 3, that gives us the chance to significantly include larger areas of the site for development.
As a former market manager, management's very important. When people go to these markets, they don't know that someone's actually running these things. But a big part of the success will be the management, and there's some options to approach this. Historically, markets were run by the city itself or the municipality, but we're seeing cities get out of the market management seat and set up typically like some other entity, a not-for-profit entity, but the fair park itself is a natural entity. They are a not-for-profit whose goals have a lot in common with the public market. That's option one. And the second option would be to issue an RFP or to look for an outside entities, typically like a 501c3 that would run this market. And the third option would be some kind of a hybrid where the fair park would maintain some direct involvement with the management and the market could be run by a third party. And that might be the best option of all. What is this phase 3? And then as the market evolves, the management can evolve too. So the management can start out lighter, quicker, cheaper as well. And as if you get to phase 3 and you have a more sophisticated real estate situation, the management too can become more sophisticated. But we really think the important thing is just to get it started, keep the costs low, keep the fun high, and evolve the market and make your next step decisions based upon observation of what's working or what's not working, and you're not getting into financial trouble while you're doing that, keeping your costs low. That is our, lighter, quicker, cheaper approach. Most of the famous markets that you've heard of all started out basically lighter, quicker, cheaper. They didn't start out with the end game. It's nice to just start out simply, let the vendors make some money, customers have some fun, not be worried about paying some big bills or having debt around your neck. Just these things. Very simple, temporary seating, some good public spaces, let the vendors have some fun setting their spaces up the way they like to set them up and express their personality. The barn, the indoor spaces are really just outdoor spaces with a cover on them. As Kathy said, there's not that much infrastructural requirement that can also evolve and become more sophisticated over time. So in phase one, the market could be, this is just an example, it could be a night market once a month in the nice weather. See how it goes. In year two, you could have some night markets, you could have some day markets, depending upon the vendor interest, the customer interest, how it's going, and then you could continue to grow the number of vendors and the number of days as the market rolls along. And that's where management, working closely with the vendors, is going to take these steps. We have run pro formas for all of these things. Your initial break even for a very simple market to get started is about 30 to 40 vendors. I don't think we need to go through all these numbers. And you can start even to make a little bit of money operationally, going from 30 vendors to 80 vendors to 120 vendors. And in phase two, when you've got more permanent spaces in barns 8, 9, and 10, the economics change, and you have permanent tenants, as I said, with the beer garden probably being an anchor tenant, and the beer garden or a restaurant could even stay open when the market's not open. So you're beginning to not just evolve the market itself, but you're beginning to evolve the fair park as an amenity for the neighborhood and as a gathering place for the city of Salt Lake. Looking at like a 5-year pro forma, with some simple assumptions, you're starting to operate year-round, you can really begin to break even almost right off the bat. Again, keeping this lighter, quicker, cheaper approach. That is a sound way to go forward. It's not a risky way to go forward to be lighter, quicker, cheaper. You can just, glance at this. I think you have a copy you can look at in more detail. But those are your income and then your expenses. And if you go all the way to the bottom, your net operating income, you can see that you can begin to, on that previous slide, begin to break even and have be operationally self-supporting fairly quickly. Next slide. So you might be thinking, well, how's this going to work? I mean, how many people do we need? Just some simple exercises. If, running the numbers with 30 vendors or 80 vendors or 120 vendors, these numbers seem very achievable. Like with 30 vendors, you need 1,000 to 2,000 customers going to the market. And that's based on vendors paying 10 to 20% of their sales as rent. Go to the next slide. With 85 vendors, you need 2,000 to 5,000 customers per market. And if when the market is fully mature, 7,000 to 14,000, which seems, with your population and with the how as we compared it with other markets, these numbers seem well within the capability of Salt Lake and your demographics. There are other additional sources of income that were not in the pro forma. The barns being improved will have probably demand from other people when there's not a market there to do something. So it's not just establishing a market, it's adding value and creating a new gathering place in Salt Lake. And they're already renting the barns out for other things, but with a little more improvements and better public spaces around them, you should see an increased demand for those spaces.
Chair, I have a quick question about the pro forma.
Yep.
You based that off Salt Lake City population and not the Wasatch Front?
Which part of the pro forma are you talking about?
You went back to talk about customers.
Yeah, well,
I'm saying, are we doing it based off Salt Lake City population, which is roughly 200,000, or are we doing off of?
The 40% of the city population, I just was looking at this, is within 10 minutes. And I think it's within the metropolitan area, it's also a pretty healthy. A third of the metropolitan area is within a 10-minute drive. So so these are not big numbers compared to your city and metropolitan demographics.
Thank you.
And then phase 3, and we're really kind of in the crystal ball at this point, because this could be in year 5, year 6, or year 7, and other things will be happening. But it's really looking at the Fair Park as a year-round destination at that point, and the market will play a role in that. But we would imagine that other people will come forward that would have an interest in investing and doing things at the Fair Park as well. In addition to the operating expenses, there are some startup costs. Getting things organized, getting your vendors figured out, getting an office set up, your fees, your permits, your legal. So this is a capital expense, not an operating expense. Now, in capital expenses, I'm going to turn back over to CRSA.
How much?
Before we get there, we're going to interrupt with some questions.
How long do you think it would take to do this setup? Like what if the money's appropriated? Like how?
Oh,
long
like
does
in
something
phase
take?
1?
Yeah.
6 months.
Okay. Thanks.
I'm just going to quickly go over some initial costs. There are some things that just need to be done to make sure the space is functional for those who are using it. Small HVAC and lighting improvements, some signage and street improvements are part of the interior costs, and some exterior costs include exterior paving, decking, food truck service, as well as some signage there. These are kind of the baseline costs to start up in phase 1. Of course, one can take these on over a series of years. They don't need to be all done at once, and really the project can be done in any phase, any number of phases that you see fit. In phase 2, the project includes additional management and operation costs and additional kind of expense when it comes to interior improvements and exterior improvements to the site. Those include kind of additional vendor stalls, adding space for and supply for people to be able to plug and play, power, data, sewer, gas service to each of their vendor stalls. So we're able to have more fixed commercial locations than temporary locations, and we're able to support kind of long-term vendor lease space in phase 2, as well as larger size exterior space. And some of this work that we initially priced has been done already by the Fair Park, as they've been doing some site improvements on the site surrounding the 3 barns as well. So some of those costs may go down. Additionally, there are some additional startup costs in phase 2 with totals for management, interior and exterior improvements. The total comes to $4.5 million. And at this point in time, it's important to consider that once the barns roll over into more year-round use, there is an important consideration, which is the replacement of the barns, which are used by the Fair Park during fair season for animal showing, and we have placed a value to that barn replacement at $1.2 million, so something would need to happen at another location within the Fair Park site to replace those barns for fair use.
But which is part of their master plan, correct?
Correct.
So where do we go from here? Well, dependent on what the RDA chooses and what the State Fair Park Board chooses, we presentations to the public, and we have done extensive presentations to the public to get where we are now, and gathered extensive input from the public to determine what their needs and wants are. But we would move into the next phase to say, okay, this is what is possible. The presentation today, somebody needs to determine who owns this, who's going to manage this project. Is it a Fair Park? Is it a city organization? Is it another nonprofit? And a go, no go decision needs to be made. Once that's made, support needs to be gathered. Management option decision needs to be made. Managers have to be identified. A business plan needs to be written and presented to funding agencies, and startup cost identified and secured.
Wonderful. Questions? Friend, can I ask real quick, has this final study been presented to the Fair Park Board?
It has.
It has or has not?
It has.
It has. Great. And what did they think?
I think we should refer that over to the Fair Park Executive Director, who is here.
Yeah. If you'll come up to the microphone for us, please. Thank you.
Perfect. First of all, thank you for allowing me.
Will you use a microphone? All of this is recorded.
I can talk really loud if necessary.
He can.
There's a seat for it. Oh, terrific. I didn't see that.
You get a seat.
Terrific. Well, thank you. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Larry Molinex. I'm the Executive Director for the Utah State Fair Corporation. Our board has reviewed the CRSA findings. They're very excited about the potential of having the international market there, and they've tasked me with the responsibility of putting a financial pro forma together and a business plan. Although the information contained, we believe, is very accurate with the number of booths, but we do business just a little bit differently. We believe there's more capital and more revenue to be captured through the food and beverage that's really not explored in this study. This study is strictly looking at booth space rental and not food and beverage percentage of gross revenue sales. So we're pretty excited about it. It's consistent with our statute. For many of you who are unfamiliar with us, we actually are under statute to develop and grow the Fair Park area and bring these types of opportunities to the community. And so we're very community focused. And we know there's a food desert over there. And we also know there's a lack of opportunity for entertainment in the evenings for individuals who live over in that area. And as that area starts to become more popular for young families, there's a need for something like this over there. So.
Great. And sorry, just real quick, have you spoken with any of the legislators that represent that area and talked about, reached out to the state about with this plan as well, or with this study?
We have. We started having these conversations about a year ago with various legislators. Okay. So the Fair Park Corporation and the Fair reports to a Fair Park board that's made up of legislators. And so we report directly to our own subcommittee. They're familiar with our intentions here and what we'd like to see have happen, as well as our local representation. Okay. And then the director of the Division of Facilities and Construction Management actually sits on our board and actually has been part of this study from day one.
Great. Questions? Board Member Wharton?
Yes. Did your board, in having you come up with what did you say, a business plan for this? Did they specify how they would like to see this governed? Are they envisioning that they would be the governing board for this project, or did they talk about doing a third entity? What was there any direction given on that?
There was no direction given on that. Primarily the focus that I've been given, or the task that I've been given, is to come up with a pro forma that's based upon our knowledge. So for many sitting here, that may seem foreign of what we just talked about. But for example, we have 410 vendors during the fair that are commercial exhibitors and another 110 that are food vendors. So we're very familiar with booking booth rental spaces for commercial exhibitors as well as food and beverage. So they're taking the position they want to see what the dollars are, and then if it works better for the community and the interested parties to have a third party corporation management, that's fine. We do events that way today. So unfortunately what we find is we get pulled back into them because of our knowledge. So.
And you said that one thing that you thought was lacking sort of in this study was food and beverage sales. What do you think that means in terms of, obviously, more money, but do you think that means that the phased timeline would develop faster, or do you envision that money for something else?
I believe that it will develop quicker. The return on the investments will improve substantially. So if I use the fair as a barometer, commercial exhibit space represents 1/3 of the revenue that's achieved from commercial space, food and beverage.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Mine's more of a comment, if you're done. So this has been going on a long time, and Danny, I just want to thank you first and foremost, because really this didn't happen until I feel like you got on board and I started hounding you. And I'm looking at Danny Walsh over here. Sorry. I'm looking at Danny. I'm going to single him out and the staff with him because this isn't what I wanted, right? I mean, when somebody says, oh, it was I had an MAI appraisal, and I just think to myself, that's made as instructed. That's all it is. And this is not made as instructed. This is actual good knowledge and depth that you've gone through and bringing up data and bringing in the community to talk about it. I mean, sure, I'd love to see $32 million thrown at the west side on North Temple, but we know that that's not feasible, right? We know that as a board, we cannot do that. There is no money to do that. But if we're looking at small increment growth like this, yeah, this is, to me, it's a no-brainer. This is something that I've seen from the beginning, that we have partners that I'm speaking for myself, Larry, and you know that. I've talked to you about this. I want to participate with this. I think this is exactly what the West Side needs. Great. And that moving forward, there's other participants too. We've got the county that can participate. We've got the state that can participate. We've got elected leaders on the west side that can go out and maybe get some state appropriated money to fund this, right? And so I think that it's just getting those partners put together. But as you go forward with your business plan to present, please, if you'd include me, I'd love to be all involved with that.
Absolutely. Be happy to. If I can interject just a little bit more information, and just as a reminder, you invited me to speak. That was a mistake. And it's because we're so passionate about the Fair Park in the area. But following the advice of some of the information we captured during this discovery process, we were able to pave that entire area. So for me, it's embarrassing to see those photos of the barns because the pavement is so bad. But all that drainage has been addressed. All new underground storm drains have been installed. That area is paved. We've installed flower beds because that became a part of a focal point that there needed to be more art incorporated. And then we've also partnered with street artists, and we've actually started incorporating art right into the Fair Park, just based upon the casual conversations that we've had, because we agree it has to be a really beautiful place for people to come there.
I want to echo what James said. I really am so excited about this idea. This is like 5 minutes from my house, and I'm in the adjacent district, so I'd love to be included in these meetings as well, and anything that we can do to help make this a reality.
Board Member Mendenhall?
This might be a silly question, but let's say we get through the phases of implementation, how does the fair operate with the market?
That's a really good question. We would like to see the first year at least where we temporarily suspend the activities in the barns to allow us to host the first junior livestock show there. Long-term plan has been that we'd like to relocate the barns to the north side of the property. And the reason being is we don't have what's considered a true back-of-house for the livestock show. In 1902, when the park was originally plotted, it worked very well. That's because everyone was making their deliveries via wagons and basically cattle drives. So now during the fair, we're actually asking exhibitors to drive their vehicles right through fair patrons to get to their animals after the exhibits close. So it's somewhat of a safety issue right now. So this isn't new for us looking at trying to relocate them to a different location.
I hope when you say relocate, you actually mean leaving these barns where they are and building new barns on the north side.
Building new barns.
Okay, thank you.
And interestingly enough, I'm not sure if you had the opportunity, but we've hosted a very large, prestigious antique show for several years in those historic barns, and that's why they're there, is they love the feeling that it brings and the vibe that it brings. And so, no, we cherish those buildings.
Are you referring to Vintage White?
Yes, I am.
Oh, well, I wouldn't know anything about that. Several purchases there.
And we're always looking at ways that we can program. Here's a little bit of a piece of information that a lot of people aren't aware of. When the outdoor retailers left Utah, we were able to negotiate and keep our small portion of that. So we continue to host the Western Winter Retailer Show, which launched this morning at 8 a.m., and we've seen that grow from 1 building to 4 buildings. And here's something I'd like you to think about is, as we continue to be successful and these events gain more and more traction, it's the day will come where they have to relocate to a larger venue, and that would be appropriate that they relocate to the Salt Palace right down the street. But that venue or that show will outgrow us the next couple of years. So if you're in the area, you want a tour, give me a call. I'd love to walk you through there.
Yes, please. Any other comments by board members? Andrew?
I would just say I'm very supportive of the project. Thank you very much for coming back with a phased concept that is careful in its growth and manage as you go. The investment James is talking about may not be on that side of the street. It may be on the white ballpark side.
Yes.
Any sense on progress on that property and how that ties into this at all in the discussions?
That's a great question. Initially, we would utilize the north side of that for additional parking to support the market. We've been working with 3 different developers that have been trying to put a large project on that corner. They've had some challenges getting all of the various property owners on the same page. We had a lengthy conversation 2 weeks ago. We're going to focus strictly on the development of the white ballpark because we were unable to get the other property owners to get on the same page. So we'll send an RFP out. We'll look for the project that is best suited for the community.
Excellent. Well, thank you for your work. I appreciate all of you.
Anyone else? I do want to say a couple of things. I love this. Thank you. I also think a new motto for all of us should be lighter, quicker, cheaper. So I'm going to just make T-shirts for everyone that say that so we remember. The Olympic model? What? Well, the pendulum needs to be somewhere in the middle. Point being, I really do appreciate this. I think that James was spot on in that there's one thing to come to us with an idea that we look at and we love. I like to call, I've been naming these the unicorns, but then we have no way to feed the unicorn, we have no way to take care of it, and we can't have it. And this is something that actually seems feasible with this approach, and I truly appreciate that. And hope that we can continue these conversations with the county, with the state, with other partners to see something like this really happen, because it's awesome. And I was recently in Detroit, and I went to the Eastern Market where they've used the old sheds. Oddly enough, it was like the one day it was closed. But one of the things that came out of the Eastern Market are some brick and mortar for some of their boutique shops that started at their Fair Park and then moved into brick and mortar in the neighborhood, which is kind of a dying neighborhood and trying to revitalize. So it was a dead neighborhood, I think, if we can all agree with Detroit. But, I mean, it's amazing, and I really appreciate it. And once again, I also want to take this opportunity to thank Cara with the RDA staff. I know how hard you've been working on the North Temple project area as a whole, and this is only one piece of all of the work that you do. I don't know how Danny got so lucky to have such amazing staff, but the city is certainly the beneficiary of it. So thank you, Cara, for all of your hard work. And if there's nothing else, let's figure out a way to have a market, huh? Okay. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Let's see. Next. You know, I have to say, this is a pretty fun agenda. For the last agenda of an RDA meeting. Thank goodness we needed it. So let's talk about affordable housing, shall we?
Yes. Tammy and Tracy are making their way up to the table. And Allison, sorry, hadn't seen the staff report yet, so. And Madam Chair, in the interest of time, we'll kind of go through this a little bit quicker than usual, and then obviously if there's any questions, please feel free to ask.
I think quick is good.
I'll try to be like quick and good. This hearing is for the
High opportunity.
I believe so, right?
Yeah, sure.
This is the high opportunity
wrong with
mill
that
fund, not the. Sorry, no, I was confusing it with the Richmond, which is also which is also affordable housing. So
It is. It's the same.
yes. Okay, Danny, I think you're wrong now.
No, it's the same.
No, this is Richmond Street, funded from the High Opportunity NOFA.
Okay. So, as you'll recall, the board in 2019 approved a notice of funding availability for $10.8 million for incentives to develop and preserve affordable housing, and of that amount, you put $4.5 million aside for projects in high opportunity census tracts. These are mostly, just say it very broadly, on the east side of the city. This Richmond Flats application is the first application of these funds that has been received. And yes, so speaking of unicorns, we've got one here. And so the goal for today for the board is to consider approving the proposed loan for this affordable housing project, at 2960 South Richmond Street. It's a $1.8 million loan request, and the developer is Community Development Corporation of Utah, the CDC. It would be approximately 60 units of affordable housing on 1.4 acres, and the units will be priced from about 41 to 60% of AMI. Most of them will be two-bedroom units or above. The $1.8 million loan would represent 13.8% of the total project cost, which was about $13 million. And city funds would represent about $30,000 per unit and would remain affordable for at least 50 years. If RDA staff would like to take over and go with the details.
All right. I think Allison mentioned a lot of those details. Again, these funds are the $4.5 million that we have had some trouble kind of getting some developers to come ask for this money, but this is the first application. This was a part of the NOFA that was released in June. The board approved the citywide projects and allocated money towards those back in September, but this is the remaining 4.5 that has not been allocated. I think, so Allison mentioned some of this, but the developer is CDC Utah. The project concept is to develop some missing middle housing type on the east side of the city that may include some affordable workforce and family rental housing. The initial development costs are totaling about approximately $13 million. But again, these are really early numbers. They are in a really kind of the earlier stages of this project. So as they get into the more details, the total number of units and the AMI targets will kind of will be amended based on kind of what zoning would be approved. And then to move from that, they are looking to rezone the property, and they will be looking at applying for tax credits. So within our timeline, we would give them about 24 months to complete those processes, and we wouldn't close on the property until then, close on the loan until then. Here's just a quick map of the property in yellow. It is on the border of Mill Creek and Salt Lake City. So let's see, and it is located within the high opportunity area. So the Finance Committee did approve these initial terms that are laid out here. The total amount would be $1.8 million, and the interest rate would be between 1% and 3%, just depending on the project capacity for repayment. So as they kind of get into more of the details of the development, we'll kind of work to fine-tune those. The term would be 30 years, and the repayment would be a cash flow repayment. In terms of the conditions, we'd want these conditions to be met before we close on the loan. The property would need to be rezoned, and I believe they are close to either submitting that application or they may have already. They would apply for tax credits and senior financing, and the RDA would approve the final financing packages in the development plan. The applicant will receive all other city and RDA approvals. And the final loan terms and conditions are reviewed and approved by the RDA Finance Committee. And the conditional commitment shall be 24 months. And the developer is here to answer any questions you may have about those details. And anything else?
Great. Board members, questions? Go ahead, James.
I wasn't going to look for a
Oh.
question. I was just going to look.
Aaron?
I actually want to make the motion, James.
That's what I was looking at you for.
Okay.
Well, could I?
Andrew
one more
wants to
thing?
speak.
Sorry.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Sorry, Madam Chair and Madam. George Chapman brought up an interesting question earlier this week about the pedestrian needs through there. Earlier, we had spoken with Mill Creek about one of the concepts we talked about with them was a little further south from here, looking at some joint ventures or some work on our end to help with streetscape improvements or those kind of things. We haven't formalized anything that way, but I think this stretch of Richmond, is it Richmond Street? I always forget. Could really use some pedestrian-friendly work done. You can't outwalk, frankly, on that strip very safely with the current traffic flows. So I think we'd probably want to talk from the city end of things or the RDA about how do we look at that little area a little more with maybe Wilt Mill Creek as a partner and talk through some ideas there.
Next, Erin.
I make a motion that the board adopt the resolution to approve a loan of up to $1.8 million to Community Development Corporation of Utah for a project located at 2960 South Richmond Street.
Second.
Madam Chair, just a friendly amendment that we in addition work with the neighboring municipality for walkability that Andrew talked about.
I'll accept that.
All right. I have a motion by Board Member Mendenhall, a second by, do you still second the friendly amendment over there, Board Member Luke? Board Member Luke. Again, before I call for a vote, I just want to say congrats, Erin. we put there. This was tough because we knew that we had $4.5 million sitting out there, and we wanted to get it out. And you successfully convinced us to wait a little bit longer. And I'm grateful that we have an applicant in this area. I'm grateful that we're going to see something for which the intent of this money was set aside. I still think we should maybe look at the boundaries, but I'm glad we waited and that you got this. So thank you for your perseverance on this one.
Thank you all for your patience. I started to feel like a mother bear guarding a wounded cub with wolves circling, but
The amount of animal imagery we have today.
But I will say, I thought of this fund, the 4.5, last week when I was at this mayor camp and learned from a gentleman who's a fellow at Harvard Kennedy School who works with communities trying to increase mobility for families and people living in low opportunity areas into high opportunity areas. So of course my ears pricked up, and he for one, has some things to work with us on through the Harvard Kennedy School, but one of the best ideas to come out of it was the city of Seattle and King County allocated money for housing navigators specifically tasked with finding housing in areas of high opportunity, existing housing, which I know is hard in our housing market, but I see Andrew smirk, and so I know that there's probably a lot of difficulties I don't know about yet, but there could be some new flexibility we build.
No, we actually talked about that at when you were at the meeting that I don't think you were here for.
When I was learning about that?
Yes. We were talking about that, and that it could be something that we come up with, and luckily, part of this money we can reallocate if need be, and if we come to a decision that might be more helpful for getting this money on the streets, right? So, anyway.
Speaking of money in the streets, there's a lot of things we can talk about. There's still, for affordable housing, median development, right? There's a lot of things that we can do for that.
Yeah. So, with that, all those in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Excellent. Also, thank you for all your work, Tammy and Tracy, on this NOFA, and your patience as well in finding somebody to actually bite the bait. So thank you.
Stick
What
with
do
the
I have next?
animal analogies.
Just stay there, everyone. Oh, funding our future sales tax, the Housing Trust Fund.
This is why I was confused, but now it's becoming clear to me, Madam Chair.
More affordable housing dollars that we are ready to put out there, right?
Correct.
Yay. All right, who's taking it away?
I'll just say a couple quick words at the beginning. As you alluded to, Madam Chair, the goal of the shift of the Housing Trust Fund administration to the RDA when it was previously in community and neighborhoods is to streamline the process for loaning city affordable loans. So that's what the goal is. We want developers to be able to access all of the available funds in the city in a much more efficient and quick manner, because that allows them to get units on the street more quickly. The Housing Trust Fund rules and purposes, as the RDA will explain in greater detail, stay the same as they were before. There's been no change in how the Housing Trust Fund is going to function. The funds will only be used for affordable housing. There's no support for other kinds of housing that the RDA may engage in other areas or with other funds. And it includes a similar role for the Housing Trust Fund Advisory Board as it had before. So I'm sure Tammy and Tracy would like to get into additional details. So,
great, thank you. So just building off of Allison's introduction, it was $2.59 million that was allocated to the RDA through the current budget year. And when the council and the RDA board allocated these funds to the RDA, there was some legislative intent that went along with it. And to summarize that intent, as Allison mentioned, it was kind of to deploy the funds in a more efficient way through a consolidated source. And also they're transferred on a trial basis, tracked separately, and deployed for low-income housing and special needs housing, and specifically to be utilized to implement the city's housing plan. Furthermore, legislative intent provided that they had to align with the current Housing Trust Fund, and that the Housing Trust Fund Advisory Board play a role in the allocation of the funds. So what is in your packet today is just a briefing on the guidelines that we have administratively developed between RDA and community and neighborhoods on how those funds will be deployed. So this is a briefing just on the $2.59 million, but there was also legislative intent that was passed when the funds were transferred, in which the council and the RDA board wanted staff and the administration to come back with a 6-month and a 12-month check-in on deploying those funds to kind of give an update on whether the intent of administering these funds in a more consolidated and efficient manner is indeed true. So we will come back with like a larger discussion on affordable housing implementation framework with the administration at a later date. So to summarize what the program and the guidelines we came up with to deploy these funds, it's pretty much how the Housing Trust Fund has been working to date. Legislative intent called for the RDA to name these funds specifically the Housing Development Trust Fund, so there's a distinction there. So the Housing Development Trust Fund, $2.59 million, can be used for acquisition, rehab, new construction. As with the Housing Trust Fund now, targeting 80% AMI below with a minimum affordability period of 50 years, with an interest rate of 3%. And this is a new kind of administrative policy that HAND was working with the Housing Trust Fund Advisory Board on when the RDA kind of stepped in. They had been working on creating some criteria for interest rate reductions. So we're going to utilize those that were developed by the Housing Trust Fund Advisory Board. So starting at 3% interest, and then projects can qualify for interest rate reductions. There's a minimum term of 30 to 40 years for the loan period, or that's the maximum, sorry. And then also applications are to be evaluated in the order they're received. So that's a little bit different than the RDA's NOFA policy, in which we've been doing competitive applications. We wanted to fulfill the intent of the Housing Trust Fund, how it had been functioning. So it's first come, first serve, essentially. The RDA is administering the application process in coordination with HAND. Applications will be reviewed by the Housing Trust Fund Advisory Board for a recommendation that is then forwarded to the RDA board. So that's another switch from before. It won't go to the City Council. They will come back to the RDA board. So that's an overview.
Thank you, Tammy. Can I ask a quick question? What's the intent of having a first come, first serve basis? Like, what's the pro to that, I guess?
The pro to that is when you have a competitive process, usually that would be administered once or twice per year. And so the timing of applications might not exactly line up with project needs. So when you're accepting applications on a competitive basis, you have to recognize that projects might be in different stages of the development pipeline a little bit. And so you have to provide some flexibility there. If you have it first come, first serve, funds are available kind of until they run out when the project needs it. So we decided administratively to administer the funds like that because that's how the Housing Trust Fund has been working to date.
So essentially it allows roughly, in layman's terms, for us to kind of have money throughout the year that people can dip into until there's no money in the piggy bank.
Yeah, and the tipping point is, I guess the question for the policymakers is there more demand for funds than there are funds available? Because then it makes more sense for a competitive process. But if there's plenty of funds available, it could make sense to be first come, first serve.
I mean, I think just off the top of my head, I would say yes. Right? It seems to me that there's probably more demand than money available. So I wonder about that way of putting out the money, and I think that's something maybe we want to talk about some more. Are there other thoughts on this? Sure, Cindy.
One of the things that we noticed when we were doing analysis as staff is that on the first come, first serve basis, you are reacting to what people are bringing to you. And so they have made a lot of the decisions about what they're building and how they're incorporating the affordable units and all kinds of things. And so you are having to adapt to their structure rather than when you're doing the notice of funds availability. What you're doing is you are putting your policy priorities first. You are saying, as a city, this is what we want to invest our money in. And so that's the difference that we were seeing in terms of analysis. It's sort of each developer comes at it from a different way, and each developer it takes a long time to figure out the twists and turns that a developer has in their pro forma and in their proposal and that type of a thing. And our experience has been that it's more transparent to do the NOFA because, and that's notice of funds availability, because then people are, you've laid out everything. It's an even playing field. And you don't require people to be at a certain point in their project. You accept proposals as they are. And so that was a major plus that we saw, and a bit of a difficulty with the first come, first serve.
Great.
If I may add to that, I think Cindy's distinction is spot on, and I think with regard to these funds, where the initial legislative intent was to try to keep the process in place that existed prior to this transfer. I think the intent of the Housing Trust Fund Board traditionally has been to use these funds almost as a bridge type of gap financing. I wouldn't say in an emergency situation, but to Cindy's point, projects would come and seek this funding when suddenly they had a gap in their capital stack and they needed a way to fill that after they had already gotten their other funding sources. And so that, I think, is why it has been treated this way. And I think, as Cindy pointed out, that's why we took the approach with the NOFA to have that more proactive approach of trying to identify our priorities up front. So I don't know if there's a right or wrong way to do it, as much as depending on what you're trying to accomplish, that's how we've prioritized it differently. So,
just a couple of a question and a comment. Unless anybody else has anything, this will be quick. When are we expecting to get this $2.5 million out there? Do we know?
We can have the applications out today at the earliest. We're ready to go.
Okay. Do you need any direction from us to do that?
I don't think so. I think we built in the administrative policies within the legislative framework that was provided.
Okay.
So unless there are any last minute changes.
Perfect. Awesome. That'll be exciting. And then for board members, kind of that discussion we were just having, we are coming back to the roles and responsibilities and sort of some role clarity between RDA and HAND that they as two teams have worked together to kind of define, but we'll be having that discussion in February, probably at a later agenda, FYI. Cool. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Unless there are any announcements from the executive director? Nope. Report and announcements from RDA staff?
Yes, we have a couple. We, first and foremost, I would like to, if the board wasn't aware already, the RDA property on Highland Drive, the former DI site in Sugar House, is currently being used by Candy Cane Corner. And if you're familiar with them, they are a holiday store for families in need that's operated by the Road Home, where they provide credits and people can go and do their Christmas shopping. And And the Santa Shack is on the plaza as well. And Amanda made sure that us as an RDA staff participated in the setup and the sorting of items within Candy Cane Corner. So we did that right as they were getting ready to open. So want to thank Amanda and both Jim for working with Candy Cane Corner and getting that set up, as well as getting us involved in that. So then the other item is just to follow up. We have submitted a email to council staff to speak about the RDA exploratory trip with a list of possible projects and ideas that we had heard from the board that maybe you wanted us to look at. We provided some options for cities that hit those. There may or may not already be conversations happening about other things we might want to tack onto that. And so as part of that, we wanted to raise that if there are other things you'd like us to look at, we are prepared to engage a consultant in starting to refine that list as well as options. And so please feel free to give us your commentary, and that way we can keep working with staff on finalizing those details.
And please do email them so we can have a great trip. You can come, Mayor-elect.
So, and then finally, we understand that we have 2 board members who this is their last meeting. And so as RDA staff, we wanted to show our appreciation to them and their time served. And we have some baskets to present. And so, Madam Chair, I don't know if this is the singing part of the meeting that you were referring to earlier. I am not singing, but but certainly we wanted to.
I'm actually going to be singing a little Paula Cole. I don't want to wait for a last.
So again, as staff, we just wanted to say thank you very much for your time, your service, and everything you
Are
have.
we opening that right now?
I don't know if I'd advertise that part of the gift too much, but
Yeah, I know. Where's mine?
yeah.
He's on Pintos.
Future get-togethers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much. Thank you very much.
Let's
Mason
see.
jars.
Some cool jars and glasses. Martinelli's sparkling cider. So
We heard
thank you very
rumors you'd
much.
like to have drinks out of
It's been
mason
an
jars.
honor to work with all of you. 8 years has been a long time. There's been a lot of great work that we've, as a board, have been honored to accompany you on. It really is great. So, Danny, thank you. Also want to thank DJ, your predecessor, and Justin for their leadership in the time. But really, you guys are great, but your staff are phenomenal. So keep up the great work. Katie, thank you for your legal prowess in all this, and it truly has been an honor. Thank you.
Well, I think I've been a thorn in your side long enough as a board member, so this should be fun. But truly, God, the RDA can do some huge things. We have done some huge things. The house that Justin built, also known as the Eccles Theater, the affordable housing, $21 million in affordable housing we put together. I mean, moving the needle in Salt Lake City in dramatic ways for 50 years. And I'll echo the thanks to DJ and Justin and to you, Danny, and all of the staff who have helped to move the needle for better for Salt Lake City. And to my peers, I think that the RDA work is distinctly different from city council work. I think it's less easy to just slip into, and I implore one or many of you to pick up the thorn that I've been carrying around and jabbing the RDA with, hopefully for a benefit in a lot of ways, and get deep into the RDA and the opportunities that we have, the economic momentum that we are experiencing, we have been experiencing in the city, won't last forever. So our opportunity right now, whether it's the public market on North Temple or high opportunity area connections for lower socioeconomic families and people in our city, there's so much we can do. The capital is there. We are the capital, both spellings of the capital, I mean. So thank you, Amy, and I think you've been a wonderful chair, and I hope you continue for 4 or 8 more years as the chair of the RDA. Thanks for putting this together.
Cheers.
Cheers. So now it's the report of the chair and the vice chair, and I am not going to make it through this without crying. So if I don't look at you, that's why. First, Aaron made me laugh. I couldn't even start. I almost lost it because of Aaron, and now I'm going to cry because of Aaron. So thanks a lot. Just kidding. But it is our relationship. That's fair. I just want to say to all of the board members how grateful I am for this group here sitting at this dais right now. This year has been quite a year for the RDA. I can only, it seems like nearly every other meeting we had, there was something controversial or protesters or a difficult decision to be made, sleepless nights, lots of sleepless nights. And I certainly couldn't have gotten through it without all of you. And of course, without the RDA staff. So thank you very much, all of you. And I have a little something for you guys. Chris, yours is on its way as my vice chair, but that's for you. This is for you. And there's
Okay, well, the box says Western Rivers Fly Fisher, so I know I'm already going to like it.
Aaron, that's a unicorn. Remember to feed the unicorn.
Okay, it's a beautiful salmon fly. So
it is.
Thank
so you're welcome. The day after I was elected into office, I went and got a fly fishing fly, a elk-hair caddis, tattooed on my side in honor of my dad, because my dad always says I can do anything and that I want. And Charlie, you have been a mentor to me and have talked me off a lot of ledges. And so this is sort of that symbolic message that I feel that as a mentor, you remind me that we can do anything that we want. And I cannot tell you how much I appreciate the friendship and the mentorship that you have shown me over the last 2 years. Whew, made it through that, but barely. So.
Thank you, Amy. Love you. Love all of you. It's been an honor. Thank you.
Okay, doke. With that, there's some written briefings. Hope you all read those, and meeting adjourned.
We will reconvene as the City Council in 10 minutes, so at 3:15 we will be back.